During my time in the Berserk and the wider anime community, I seem to have noticed two patterns when it comes to Griffith discourse. One, that no one understands the guy, like at all, and two, that no one's giving him the appropriate amount of sympathy for what he went through. This caught my eye most recently when I made a post on Reddit defending Griffith for his selfless actions throughout the Golden Age arc, and the responses went from incoherent to frankly scary. This unhinged, vitriolic hate, which leaves fans frothing at the mouth anytime someone offers even a hint of nuance to Griffith's character, is a huge problem that stops fans from truly appreciating how well written Berserk is, and it limits the enjoyment and range of emotions you can feel while experiencing it. Now I just want to preface this video by thanking Kyle Entertainment. This video has been a couple of years in the making, and it was his initial reaction to my point of view which prompted me to make this video in the first place. He does some pretty good analysis videos in anime such as Berserk and Attack on Titan, with a forewarning that he has some pretty outrageous takes sometimes. But that's what we like on this channel. We're fans of interesting takes, not correct ones. Check him out if you haven't already. I also want to make clear that I am laying out the case not to say that Griffith is perfect, but that he is about as moral as Guts, and shouldn't be hated any more than him. I'm going to be laying out the argument as to why Griffith was motivated by empathy, not selfish ambition, and why his rape of Casca doesn't reflect on his morality or character in the Golden Age arc. Also, why most of the hate towards Griffith is manufactured mob outrage that people participate in more to feel like a part of the community, rather than an honest, principled disagreement with any of his actions. So with all that out of the way, what exactly are people getting wrong about Griffith's character? And why is the hate so undeserved? To answer this question, I've laid out my defense of Griffith into these key areas. Why Griffith's goal is a noble one. Why Griffith's motivation for achieving said goal is a noble one. Why almost everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie, and how most fans have fallen for Griffith's persona. Why Griffith and Femto are essentially different characters, and the actions of Femto can't be applied to the nature of Griffith throughout the Golden Age arc. Why Berserk is bad if you disagree with my correct opinions. And how most fans are hypocritical in their reception of other characters in the story. Now that I've framed the main outline of my argument, let's get into the most commonly overlooked facet of Griffith's character concerning his morality, his end goal. A frequent thing you'll hear in anti-Griffith spaces is how he sacrificed all his men who were loyal to him and trusted him for his own selfish goals, with that goal being for ultimate power as a monarch over a kingdom within his control. Sounds pretty bad, right? Such selfish ambition, akin to some of the worst characters in Game of Thrones. But here's where I tell you that this is a dishonest oversimplification of his goal, framed to paint his actions as self-centered and unconcerned with the well-being of others, when really, that's not the case at all. While it's true that his own goal was to have his own kingdom, an ambition played as a common trope in other media, when they're trying to portray power-hungry, selfish villains whose actions are reprehensible, and show no regard for those they use to achieve it, this just isn't the case when it comes to Griffith. If you dig a little deeper into the text, you'll find a much more sympathetic and noble goal than is presumed at face value by many. One that I'm for sure on board with. Martyrdom for a merciless god. What a waste. On the battlefield, the life of a common soldier isn't even worth a single piece of silver. In today's world, most people's lives are subject to the whims of a handful of nobility and royalty. Of course, even a king can't exactly live as he pleases. We are all at the mercy of a great tide, fate, or whatever you wish to call it. And we all disappear in the end, our lives spent, never even knowing who we were. In life, unrelated to one's social standing or class as determined by man, there are some people who, by nature, are the keys that set the world in motion. They are the true elite, as dictated by the golden rule of the universe. It should be obvious from that excerpt that Griffith's goal is of course a noble one. He wants his own kingdom to achieve equality, a society in which people are free to achieve their full potential, unrestrained by the chains of their socioeconomic status as forced on them by an unelected hereditary aristocracy. Griffith's dream is that of meritocracy, where even a peasant boy can become a great leader based on their own talent, rather than their blood and family crest. A dream dreamt up by a disempowered boy in the slums beneath Windham Castle, a dream that the world could one day be a better place, and that he could prove it, and be a rallying cry for workers everywhere, in the face of an oppressive medieval system. Griffith is essentially a base liberal in a feudal society, a cool progressive, and you can see this play out throughout the entire story. Griffith acts as a voice for the disempowered, be it through undermining the authority of those in power, or giving disenfranchised soldiers the opportunity to rise through the ranks through his Band of the Hawk. So whenever someone claims that Griffith's goal in creating his own kingdom is a selfish one, just remember this scene, one of longing, where he voices his spite at the aristocracy for allowing so many bodies to pile up on the battlefield, whose dreams were snuffed out by the unfair nature of a social hierarchy. That is what he hates so much, and that is what he is fighting to dismantle. Now, I'm sure in hearing this, a lot of you have been irked by my framing of Griffith's motivation in such a rose-tinted way. You assert that Griffith didn't at all care about his men. Look at the eclipse. Look at his dream speech with Charlotte. You can't really believe that Griffith cares about anyone but himself when he views and treats others like objects and pawns, right? Wrong. You've been swindled, my friend.
You can never tell the truth, or you can tell something that sounds like it.
One of my biggest gripes with anime and manga as a medium is the quality of the dialogue. There's a huge issue in the vast majority of manga series with dialogue that is badly written, with characters saying the most obvious and blunt of things and endless monologuing about character motivations and psychology, with no thought by the author as to whether anyone would speak like this in real life, and seemingly no grasp of show don't tell whatsoever. It deprives many of these series of much needed characterization and personality, and I would argue that this is the main barrier for newcomers trying to get into the medium. It's this low quality of dialogue which has created a culture of compromise and low expectation within the anime sphere, with many vocal anime defendants encouraging people to simply ignore it and excuse it as simply a feature of the medium influenced by a different culture. This is the attitude that people have gone into Berserk with, one that takes monologuing at face value and expects the dialogue to be surface level. This is a travesty, because Berserk is one of the few manga series that aren't like that. It's what drew me towards it in the first place. One of the main things that makes Miura such a genius as an author is how he deconstructs the classic anime trope of unsubtle monologuing, by framing these instances in a way that makes you question whether what a character is saying is true or not, which gives an otherwise shallow scene much needed depth and nuance. Let's take Guts' Bonfire of Dreams speech for example. The delivery of the dialogue would be considered incredibly cheesy and poorly written, if not for the way Miura has characterized Guts' relation to Griffith beforehand. Griffith has always been a pretentious character, especially since his elaborate display of superiority at the Primrose Hall, and we've seen how Guts has responded to this by trying to imitate Griffith to seek his approval as a true friend, by attempting to find a dream of his own that he can pursue, something that he had never thought of beforehand. When applying this added context to the Bonfire of Dreams speech, it's clear that Guts is also mimicking Griffith's pretentious way of speaking, by monologuing about his inner thoughts and dreams, something he never would have done in the past. It adds a tragic edge to the scene, as if Guts is still a desperate child seeking approval from his older peers, obviously a result from his relationship with Gambino, going so far as to act like his role model, but without the elegance or grace for him to not be cringeworthy. This is just one example of how Miura's ambiguous style of writing dialogue elevates Berserk so far above its contemporaries. Now let's apply this line of thinking to Griffith. When hearing Griffith's dream speech at face value, you'll no doubt get the impression that Griffith sees himself as superior to all his men, and he doesn't care about them emotionally, because he only sees them as pawns for his greater goal, as they have no dreams of their own. It's this interpretation of Griffith's words that informs Griffith haters when looking at later scenes, and it's incredibly misguided. There are simply too many scenes contradicting this viewpoint. In the lake scene with Casca, Griffith is so depressed and traumatized by the death of the boy soldier that he whores himself out in order to prevent any more men dying for him, being so distraught that he resorts to self-harm. Why did Griffith go to such lengths to save Guts again and again? These aren't the actions of a sociopath with no empathy. With all this in mind, It's clear that Griffith's words here are lies, and that he doesn't truly view them as pawns. So if Griffith truly does care about his men, as showcased throughout Casca's backstory, why is Griffith saying the opposite in this scene? To answer this question, we have to step back a bit. You see, while Griffith's ambition is to make the world a fairer and more egalitarian one, it's still the case that he's been socialized in a culture that promotes the patriarchal values he should theoretically be fighting to undermine. In a world such as Berserk's, a good leader must be strong and stoic, ruthlessly ambitious, without the emotional vulnerability of women. When Griffith's childlike goal of attaining his own kingdom was brought to the battlefield, he was met with the brutal reality of war. Countless men were dying all around him, for him, so that he could attain his dream. The guilt was overwhelming. He knew he couldn't continue fighting on with the weight of all the dead on his shoulders. So he developed a persona, molded around his society's patriarchal ideas, to cope with the guilt that he felt. Griffith's monologuing about not caring about his men here is essentially copium, where he's convinced himself that he is a cold, unempathetic leader who simply views his men as pawns. He's objectified them in his mind so that he doesn't have to deal with the emotional baggage of all that have died for him. This is because deep down, Griffith is motivated by empathy and guilt, not selfish ambition or a lack of care. This is what I mean when I say that most people have fallen for Griffith's persona, the mask he's adopted, which doesn't reflect his true self. You might say, well, why doesn't he just stop trying to attain his goal if it's leading to the deaths of so many soldiers? Because Griffith cares too much about their dreams to stop. From the death of the first soldier, he's been bound to continue the path to his dream in order to ensure that his men didn't die for nothing, to ensure that they died for a greater purpose, a dream they clung to and risked their lives for. Griffith would be an infinitely worse person for stopping now, with tens of thousands of dead soldiers who would have died cold, miserable, meaningless deaths if he didn't push on to finish what he started. If Griffith wasn't driven by overwhelming guilt and empathy, why did the God Hand show him visions of his fallen comrades when trying to convince him to become Femto, instead of wealth and fame and glory and castle walls? They guilt-tripped him into sacrificing the Hawks because they knew that he didn't want his soldiers to die for nothing, their lives spent. People claiming that Griffith was selfish and didn't care about his men are therefore way off base. Now, going back to the dream speech, there are two obvious indicators that he's lying here. One is Mura's composition of the scene. The entire scene is framed as a theater, with Griffith and Charlotte on an elevated platform performing for the observing audience below, that being Guts and Casca. The whole scene has an incredible performative energy to it, and Griffith's speech here sounds more like a Shakespearean soliloquy than anything an honest person would say. The second indicator that Griffith's behavior here is a dishonest front that he's put up to convince both himself and others that he is the superior, uncaring leader that he wishes he could be at heart, is the way the scene is contrasted by the lake scene with Griffith and Casca in the next mini-arc. Here, both characters are younger, and Griffith has not yet fully developed his persona. Casca here acts in the same role as Charlotte, without being an impressionable follower of Griffith, who Griffith wishes to be seen as strong and competent by in the scene. The key difference is, here, the persona is crumbling. He struggles to put up a brave front by insisting that he didn't care about the death of the boy soldier, but you know he's bluffing because he's literally shaking and resorting to self-harm to calm his distress, for a moment showing his true guilt and empathy towards those that had died for him, before he regains enough composure to slip back behind his mask once more. It's a great contrast to the later dream speech, in which Griffith's greater experience and time to reflect has allowed him to create a much more elaborate persona for himself, one with all the theatrical gusto to make anyone blush. And it's all a lie. Now, I think it's important to apply this newly realized interpretation to his relationship with Guts. More people are willing to admit that Griffith did truly care about Guts, unlike his men by their interpretation, but they see it as a love for an object that Griffith owns, that he can control, and one which would never disobey them. The text simply contradicts this viewpoint. Griffith did truly love Guts, and not in an objectifying way, but in the true sense. It was Guts who first showed the weaknesses in Griffith's persona, because caring for someone the way Griffith obviously cared for Guts would never fit into Griffith's narrative that he'd constructed for himself as an uncaring, purely ambitious leader above any mere soldier. He knew that he couldn't let that stand, so he constructed a new cope in his head to justify his gay love for him. You belong to me. He convinced himself that Guts was his plaything and a valuable soldier to the Hawks, one that was worth protecting simply for strategic reasons, but everyone around him could see that that wasn't the full story. Casca and Judo, to name but two. With this in mind, it's easy to map Griffith's slow opening up and shedding of his persona throughout the arc, as he gets closer to and more comfortable around Guts. At the beginning of the arc, Griffith says to Guts, "You belong to me." Here Griffith's persona is on full display. Later on, when Griffith saves Guts at the rear guard, Guts asks him why, and Griffith replies that it's because he's a valuable soldier to him, from a strategic perspective. Then, a few years later, when he saves Guts from Zod, he replies that he doesn't need a reason why he put himself in harm's way for Guts. Griffith is slowly making the emotional steps to start opening up to Guts here, even going so far as to ask him whether he thinks Griffith is cruel for leading so many men to their deaths. And I think that had they been together longer, Griffith would have eventually confessed his feelings towards him. Here we can see that during Griffith's time knowing Guts, he's been slowly dropping the mask to reveal his true self. But then, the unthinkable happened. Guts tries to leave the Hawks. This emotional gut punch is too much for Griffith to handle, and he couldn't process the things he was feeling because his emotional repression had meant that he hadn't developed his emotions, and it threatened his self-image so much that he snapped right back into his persona as a defense mechanism. You belong to me. But it was no use. In a last desperate attempt to project himself as a strong and invulnerable leader, he sleeps with Charlotte as a way to compensate for his feelings of emasculation, having been left by Guts. Bear in mind, his only motivation for pursuing such a hyper-masculine self-image is so that he can continue to ensure that his fallen men didn't die for nothing, and so that he could continue the path to his dream. Griffith's downfall was that he was too empathetic in a setting that would not allow for it, and it's a cautionary tale against toxic masculinity, and the repression of emotions that many men undergo in pursuit of a hyper-masculine ideal. So now that we've established the true nature of Griffith's goal, motivations, and the degree of care he felt for those around him, it should be hard for anyone not to empathize, agree, and support Griffith's actions and feelings, given the context of his difficult position. That is, people would feel this way, if not for what he did to Casca. I've always had a hard time believing that anyone would unironically be mad at Griffith's actions in sacrificing the Hawks during the eclipse. It's the most milquetoast, immoral action you could be outraged at. For one, sacrificing 100 men to ensure that tens of thousands didn't die in vain, and to allow for a utopian society to flourish for many millions of people, free of war, violence, and scarcity, seems like a no-brainer to me. The only reason anyone cares so much is because of how the narrative is framed to have us care about the characters that were in the eclipse. Just because you've spent the time to grow attached to Judo doesn't mean his life had any more value than the boy soldier that died on the battlefield, or any number of the thousands that had already died. You're condemning them to a meaningless death if you honestly condemn Griffith's actions here, especially considering that all of the Hawks would have willingly given their lives for Griffith and his dream anyway. While it's no doubt a moral conundrum, it's pretty goofy to get so worked up about it and direct your anger towards Griffith rather than the unfair nature of the situation as a whole. The only justified anger you could direct towards Griffith is through his rape of Casca, one that wasn't done exclusively to further his goal, although the cursed child was obviously essential to attaining Griffith's kingdom. His motivation here was obviously that of spite towards Guts and a desire to punish him for causing Griffith's downfall. I won't deny that this is an unforgivable action. What I will deny, however, is that this guy, Femto, is even the same character as Griffith. Now hold on, let me explain. The first thing that people often go to when arguing that Griffith was always a piece of shit and never cared about anyone but himself is his horrific rape of Casca. This one scene should be irrefutable evidence towards Griffith's lack of empathy and unforgivable evil. I argue that Griffith and Femto are different characters. in the sense that you can't use the actions of Femto to draw conclusions about the nature of Griffith's character pre-transformation. Why? Because the transformation alters your very self. Griffith's transformation into Femto artificially stripped him of his empathy through the mystic power of the idea of evil, while magnifying his negative traits, meaning that the Femto that raped Casca was not the same person as the Griffith just before the transformation. You might say that this is some insane headcanon on my part, but the text spells it out plainly.
"Oh, their deaths are piercing through me. How strange! I can't feel anything. What's this? The last tear you will ever shed."
This exchange between Griffith and the idea of evil during the transformation makes it clear that his ability to feel empathy and guilt has been taken away from him, not through bog-standard character development, but through the power of God, who even suggests that his last tear crystallizes as a bayolet used by the next apostle. Griffith's surprise at not feeling anything at those who were dying around him indicates that he expected to feel anguish, proving that he did possess empathy in the first place, but some power beyond him has freed him from it. This idea that Femto is the manifestation of Griffith's negative traits without the empathy, that was always his fatal flaw, is the only one that can make sense when looking at Griffith's actions from the time he was rescued to the sacrifice at the eclipse. Griffith in the dungeon displayed both spite and hatred towards Guts for putting him in that situation, as well as love and care for him, with a desire to see him not hurt. This dichotomy is perfectly encapsulated by Griffith's attempt to strangle Guts, and then his subsequent hesitation and caressing of Guts' arm, showing that Griffith's love for Guts overrode his hatred for him in this state of mind. This is also crystal clear when looking at how Griffith tried to save Guts from falling during the eclipse, obviously still caring about his well-being. It's clearly been shown to us by Miura again and again that Griffith could never have hurt Guts out of spite in this state. So my argument towards the transformation's psyche-altering effects hold the most weight in being true. Griffith would never have raped Casca pre-transformation, so my assertion that he was motivated by empathy throughout the Golden Age remains true. Now some of you might be crying, hold on, didn't Griffith also try to rape Casca in the tent? He tried it before. You can't say he was any different back then. Now this argument comes from a shallow misunderstanding of the scene with Casca in the tent. It wasn't an attempt by Griffith to rape Casca, but it was a sexual advance more akin to what he did with Charlotte than what he did to Casca during the eclipse. Let's look at the eclipse scene. Here, Griffith's motivation for raping Casca is entirely to hurt Guts out of spite, where Casca is simply a means to do so, a sword that he uses to deal as much pain as he can to Guts. Griffith's eyes remain on him the entire time. Casca's feelings or perception of Griffith didn't matter at all in that moment. She was a pawn to him, just as Griffith had convinced himself that that was what he thought of her beforehand. This is not the case at all in the tent scene. Griffith's advance on Casca here was entirely motivated by a desire for her to see him as a strong, competent, attractive man, just as she once had. This was after he had felt emasculated by her pity towards him throughout the previous few chapters, and he wanted her to love him again. You can't compare the two scenes whatsoever. One involved a disregard for her pain and suffering, and the other involved a motivation for her to feel positive emotions towards him. So that argument falls flat. While it's true that Griffith's advance on Casca here is problematic, as it was with Charlotte, it is of course forgivable, especially considering what Guts did to Casca in Volume 23. And this is where I get to fan hypocrisy surrounding the reception of different characters. Guts sexually assaulting Casca was far worse than anything human Griffith did during the Golden Age arc. And yet people forgive him. Why? Because he's the main character, and the narrative has pushed the audience to empathize with Guts. You might say that Guts' mental state was in an awful position when he did that to her, being recently possessed by spirits and having been exhausted from protecting her. For one, that is not an excuse. And two, have you seen Griffith's mental state during that time? The most hilarious defense of Guts here is that it wasn't Guts, but his Beast of Darkness. Like, motherfucker, the Beast of Darkness isn't real. It's a metaphorical manifestation of his shadow! You can't defend Guts' actions by saying it's just the negative side of him. Guts clearly didn't possess enough empathy here to stop himself from doing what he did. That's not at all the case with Femto, whose empathy had been artificially stripped from him. The fact that you can believe that the Beast of Darkness is a separate entity to Guts that appeared out of the ether with no explanation, but find it far-fetched that Femto is the negative half of Griffith, as mystically altered through the transformation, is insane to me. The selective reasoning for Berserk fans is infuriating. The last and biggest piece of evidence towards the transformation artificially stripping Femto of his empathy during the transformation is Griffith's words at the Hill of Swords. After the transformation, he returned there to see if he still felt anything towards those that had died for his dream, which would indicate the presence of empathy. And when he didn't feel anything, he exclaims that he's finally free. The only thing he felt at all in the sequence was towards Casca, indicating that the only positive emotions he feels towards people now come from the cursed child inside of him. So now that I've laid out my defense of Golden Age Griffith as being a separate entity to Femto, why would Miura write this story so that Femto is an entirely different character? Doesn't that make Berserk bad? Not at all. To explain why this is such a genius move, we have to look at the whole context of Griffith's character.
Woke up, had a ball, tried to comb across my bone.
The transformation essentially alters your being into one that you always desired to be, and for Griffith, that was always one with a ruthless, cold-hearted regard for those around him, with a certain lack of empathy, as that is what he always romanticized in a strong, masculine leader, fit to lead an army into battle, traits that Griffith was never able to attain as a mortal. We see consistently throughout the Golden Age arc, Griffith's attempts to convince himself and those around him that he's a cold, calculated man who takes what he wants and would use anyone without care in order to achieve his goal, when truly his persona was a wobbly one which he couldn't fully adopt, due to his personality being too empathetic and caring to be able to manifest that ideal within himself. He wished desperately that he could encapsulate these toxically masculine ideals so that he could continue fighting without caring for the deaths of the men who died for him, while ironically they were the reason he kept on fighting in the first place. How could such a weak-willed man fight on and ensure they died with meaning if he broke down and gave up with every child that died for him? But in the end, it's no use. His gay love for Guts and the emotional pain he felt when losing him caused his persona to shatter. For all you Jordan Peterson tards out there, this is known as the disintegration of the persona in Jungian psychology, because I know you guys love tying Berserk into Jung. He was left broken and spiraled into a depression that led to his downfall. This narrative downfall is essentially Miura's lesson to the audience of the dangers of pursuing unrealistic hypermasculine ideals, and how emotional repression leads to a lack of communication in relationships, leading to their breakdown and a potential loss of all you hold dear. He wants you to be like Guts, someone who opens up and lets people in to show your vulnerability, so that you can eventually heal, and not like Griffith, who rejected offers of support and affection from Casca by denying his own humanity, which led to his downfall. Griffith's story is a critique of toxic masculinity, which leads men to pursue a life of loneliness and a lack of meaningful relationships, eventually resulting in suicide. Griffith was a victim of society at large, one that necessitated the pursuit of a toxically masculine ideal in order to find success in a patriarchal society built around the exploitation of men to die as cannon fodder, and women as helpless victims of war and disempowering social structures, resulting in sexual violence. Miura could have simply shown this message of anti-toxic masculinity and the consequences of emotional repression through Griffith's loss of everything and eventual becoming of a frail shell of his former self, and that would have been a perfectly serviceable story. But instead, Berserk decided to go full-on meta. It's not enough just to show the consequences of the pursuit of such a harmful ideal when a person is unable to attain it, but what if they were theoretically able to? What if someone truly embodied the hypermasculine ideal that Griffith attempted to pursue? One of overpowering dominance over women and a lack of emotionality as a strength. What would that look like? That's where the transformation comes in. It turned Griffith into what he desired to be most in the world. His ideal self in his own mind, which was one that embodied toxic masculinity. That is what Femto represents in this scene, the ultimate personification of the hypermasculine ideal that's so highly valued in Berserk's, and to a degree our own, world. With the rape representing the ultimate consequences of taking such an ideal to its logical extreme, the rape and abuse of women. Femto using Casca here to assert his dominance over Guts is both a commentary on the toxic way men compete for dominance, as well as their perception of women to be possessions and a status symbol for men. This is the logical conclusion of a society that values toxically masculine traits, a rape culture, and suffering for both men and women alike. This scene is also supposed to reset all three characters, bringing them from the height of nuance to utter simplicity. Guts sheds all contemplated, aimless nuance to become a straightforward, vengeful character, with as strong a goal as you could ever have, and Casker loses all her complex maturity that she's built up over the course of the arc, to be raped by the man who saved her from rape in the first place, while being used as an object to further Griffith's goals, ironically what she always wanted to be for Griffith, a sword for him, used to hurt guts. Both characters here achieve what they always wanted, albeit in a twisted and ironic way. What more fitting end is there for Griffith's character then, than one which attained the ideal that they always wanted to be, and that this is the disastrous result? That is why Berserk is only great fiction if Femto and Griffith aren't the same entity. The rape scene is the perfect encapsulation of everything wrong with men in society. The real reason so many people hate this interpretation is that there are a worrying number of people in the Berserk community who are reactionary MGTOWs, or men going their own way. Essentially woman-hating incels and anti-feminists who seem to gravitate towards anything Jordan Peterson related, and Berserk falls into this category with its references to Carl Jung and individualism. While there's no doubt that Berserk's messages for self-improvement and self-motivation through the character of Guts have done a lot of good for people, it's also the case that it brings a lot of toxic people to the fanbase, especially considering the misogyny which rears its head every once in a while. With all that said and done, I hope that I've outlined to the best of my ability why Griffith is a defensible character, worthy of sympathy throughout the Golden Age arc, whose flaws and toxicity are rooted in a desire to ensure that the men who died for him did so with a purpose, to create a more egalitarian society rooted in empathy. No doubt I'll get hate for this, but for the few people who do agree with me, thanks for watching the video.